Welcome. Welcome, everybody, to the companion podcast to Podcasting for Small Business, the essential blueprint to launch your podcast. I'm Ray Sidney Smith, along here with my co host and co author, Steve Orr. How's it going, Steve?
It's going great, Ray. I say this every time, excited to be here.
Fantastic. I'm excited to be here too. In this episode, we are starting this episode 9 by diving into chapter 9 of the book, where we talk about how to syndicate to podcast directories. Don't worry, we're going to talk about what that really means in a moment. But this is really a crucial step in getting your episodes heard and listened to. Think about this for a second. There was a time you would open a phone book and you would find a business a local business in that phone book. And today, of course, you just Google it. And that's what we talk about in the book, is the fact that we've gone through this new way to discover small business podcasts. And you have to do more than just literally hit publish on your page. You have to go ahead to make sure your show is found wherever your audience may be listening. And so in this episode, we're going to talk about how podcast discovery has evolved over times and why directories matter really more than ever. We're going to talk through those pieces. The biggest distribution mistakes podcasters make, they make a lot of them, and we'll talk a little bit about how to avoid them. And we cover that in the book, but it's really important for folks to understand that, and some simple ways for people to get their podcast everywhere it needs to be. So let's go ahead and dive in to our discussion on how syndication and podcast directories work. And so, Steve, do you want to give kind of a basic overview of what we talk about kind of as the Google moment here, and where discovery now happens before listening even starts?
To me, it's really the discovery part is getting your podcast host filling out all the data that you need to fill out in that podcast host, because there's a lot of metadata that you need: title, category, stuff like that, show notes, all that stuff kind of goes in there. Stuff that you need to think about before you actually get your podcast heard. And you need to do that correctly. Otherwise, you're going to have problems down the road when you want to have your podcast discovered. And now I know this is more in your wheelhouse than it is mine. So I know there's very specific steps just to do all of that. Do you want to outline some of those specific steps so folks get a better idea of how it actually works?
Yeah. So you touched on most of them in the sense of what we would want people to know. So let's start off with the fact that your podcast is in essence a blog. Basically, it's a blog that incorporates a media enclosure, right? This little tag that attaches an audio file. And again, as we said in the last episode, RSS specs say that you can have an audio file, a video file, or PDF as part of it to create a podcast. But in most cases, we're talking about audio. And so you have this audio file that's embedded within the RSS feed coming from your podcast media host. And those two things together, the blog post and the audio file together, get presented to podcast directories in order to be able to be listed in that directory as having new episodes being published. So we take that metadata. The metadata is basically any data that is not the actual content. So in our case, that's everything aside from the audio file. And so that could be your show notes, it's the title of the podcast, it's who is the host or co-hosts or other kinds of people associated with it, where you can tag that now inside of the feed. So you can say like, oh, this is a co-host, this is the producer of the podcast. You can give all kinds of credits. You can give the date the podcast was released or edited or updated. You can provide tags for those purposes. You can also say what category the podcast is associated with in the podcast directories of choice. And so all of that data is packaged up and sent over to these directories. And now this was created because there was really no way to find a podcast other than manually telling a place, hey, I have a podcast and you should present this to other people. So podcast discovery was this mechanism for being able to find podcasts in places where you knew that it was set up in such a way that you'd actually be able to subscribe to it. This is a good place for us to pause and talk about what subscribing means. And we detail this in the book, but But Steve, can you kind of help folks understand what the difference is between subscribe or follow or whatever?
I just wanted to add one thing before we got to that, if that's okay. When we were talking about metadata, description also is another key piece of that, which I don't believe you touched on. Like the description of the podcast goes into that as well.
Yeah, so
So,
typically your show notes are the description
oh,
itself.
so you're
So,
okay, you're putting that all in that one bucket.
yeah,
Okay,
so you don't
I
have
wanted
a
to make that clear.
yeah, so you don't have a separate field for description. You do have for the entire podcast a separate description field where you can describe what the podcast, in totality, broadly is about, or specifically is about, depending upon the podcast subject. But you have that description field. But then for each episode, the blog post itself is basically the description slash show notes slash anything you want to provide to people in terms of content right there in that one field.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. So you had mentioned subscribe versus follow, and here's where it gets a little confusing. To me, it gets confusing because there's Apple Podcast subscriptions, which make it a little bit more confusing. So, also with just the word subscribe, most people, when they hear the word subscribe, assume there is a cost versus follow, follow me, which there is no cost. But Apple, at least probably in your opinion as well, has made it a little confusing because there is a fee associated with Apple Podcast subscriptions. So ultimately, whether you're subscribing or following, that means that you will get your podcast in your feed. When you do that, it'll pop up when a new episode happens. So am I on the same page as
Yes.
you are in this particular issue?
Yes. One, subscribe and follow for the most part is the same thing, except in the case of Apple Podcast subscriptions, where there may be a fee associated with it, and with specific premium podcasts, which are podcasts that have a fee for you to be able to listen to those podcasts. Many times you'll have a free version with ads and then a non free version. That is paid that removes the ads from those particular podcasts. And so this does create some level of confusion. The reality is that in general, you could just hit subscribe. And if it doesn't present you with a payment modal, then it's free. And that's pretty much the best you could
That's
do.
easy.
Yeah, and Apple has obviously changed the language because they did create the Apple Podcast subscriptions product. And so follow is the term. Now, follow is not the same thing as subscribing. And so when you follow, you are merely getting a notification when a new podcast episode is released. And so you have to go into Apple Podcasts in the app and actually tell it, hey, I want you to download the new episode. I want you to, put it in the list at the particular point and that kind of thing. And so there is a little bit of nuance between what subscribe is and follow in Apple Podcasts versus all of the rest. So, like, for example, I use Pocket Casts because I'm typically on the Android operating system. I have all the various operating systems always around me, but my main driver is a Google Pixel device, and so Pocket Casts gives me the ability to subscribe to podcasts, and those podcasts, when I subscribe, automatically give me the function to download new episodes, put them in a particular order, and or notify me about those new episodes. So it's just a matter of figuring out what that app you're using provides you with the features to be able to go ahead and do that. Remember that for you as a small business owner, you should be encouraging your followers, your subscribers, your listeners, let's go with listeners, to basically subscribe to the podcast in such a way or follow the podcast in such a way in the Apple Podcast world so that they turn on the feature to download the episodes. Right? You want those downloads because you do not know who's following you and listening to you until that download happens. There are lots of robots out there, basically software out there, that are constantly pinging and dinging your podcast. And so that's not a reliable number for you to tell, hey, how many people are actually listening to me? But the more reliable is when they download the episode and listen to it inside the podcast app or in a web browser if they're using the web media player. So we want to make sure that you are verbally encouraging them. So right now, I could say, hey, if you're listening to this, make sure that when you subscribe or follow in your podcast app of choice, turn on the feature to download the episode automatically so that when we do put out new episodes, it just shows up in your podcast app, right? Now you know. Now you can go do that. And now that benefits Steve and I in the sense that we actually know that you're actually listening to the episodes as opposed to a bunch of robots that are constantly pinging and dinging the podcast just to know that it exists. Okay. So I wanted to kind of cover that first. I know I moved it around in our outline today, but that's
Mhm.
because Steve made a point in our outline to point out that podcast directories and apps are really the new gatekeepers of your media that you're trying to get in front of folks. Now, this is changing to some great extent, and it's something that I talk about in the book, as kind of a little story about my experience with podcasts, which is that I realized very early on that SEO was really, really powerful. Right, every time I wrote a blog post and then embedded the audio to it, as long as the blog post was really good, then people would associate my podcast with the blog, and therefore I'd get this additional exposure. But that's beside the point here, in the sense that when you are thinking about podcast directories and the podcast apps that you're listening to podcasts in, and that your listeners are listening to them in, they are their own forms of search engines. So it's kind of like going to a library, and you go to the library, punch a name of a topic into the library register. What's that experience like for you, Steve? You go there and you go to the library looking for a book. Maybe you ask the librarian, but before you go to the librarian, you typically go to the terminal. We're no longer doing the Dewey Decimal System, so we're going to the machines and
You
typing in
know, the
keywords.
machines, yes, I'm old school. I still pull out that card from the file, pull out that file in the
Yeah, we don't have those
library.
anymore in libraries.
Oh, okay.
But
No,
explain to
seriously.
people. So yeah, but explain to people how the library is very similar to the way in which a podcast directory works.
It's really just a way to search. So it's kind of like it's today's search engine,
Mhm.
which, search engine, you mentioned in the opening that we used to have a phone book, and you'd flip through the pages of the phone book to find a local business or whatever it is you're looking up, doctor, whatever it is, and that's how you'd find it. The search engine really replaced the phone book. So to me, that's what it is. It's not that complicated. It's just a new way to think about finding stuff, but you're not going to find, when I sort of talked about thinking of it as a gatekeeper, it's really thinking of it as a search engine replaced the phone book. The podcast directories and the apps are really just the new gatekeeper for your podcasts rather than your local business itself, which would have been in the phone book but were replaced by the search engine. I probably muddled that up tremendously. So
Let
clean
me
it up for me, Ray.
Yeah, I'm gonna parse this apart for folks so they can understand it maybe a little bit differently. And that is to say that there are many entry points to finding a podcast. But one of the foundational elements of the podcast directories is the fact that there are some like we have foundation models in AI today. These models that basically are the Genesis foundations for many other uses. We have these foundation podcast directories. Apple Podcasts is one of them, right? So many other directories use Apple Podcasts as a source for knowing whether or not your podcast exists in the first place. It's kind of like when you had to you had to manually submit to Google. You have to manually submit. I used to be one of those people who reviewed Google listings and would when you submitted your website, I would go in and I would actually look to make sure you were a real website with a real publisher, and then you would only get submitted to the Google Index by virtue of having a human reviewer dictate whether or not you would get listed in the Google Index. And so that is the case with podcasts today. We're still there, right? Where you have to actually submit, and then a human or some automated system reviews the podcast feed, make sure that it abides by the specifications it needs to in order to be syndicated out to other places, to other podcast apps and other directories, and then you are listed, which is why it's not an automatic process, and where you just like submit it and all of a sudden you're live everywhere. It's much faster today than it used to be. Believe you me, when I got started, you'd submit and it'd be days before you'd be heard.
I just wanted to say something about that. You reminded me of my early days with podcasting when I was at the Market Watch Radio Network, how we did it back back in the dark ages. So we would have an FTP server, which you're
Yeah.
probably familiar with.
Oh,
We
yeah.
would upload the audio and fill out all these data points, and we would upload that to an FTP server, and that would eventually go to the MarketWatch website. That we didn't have a separate website for any of the audio that we did with the radio network. It would just suddenly appear on the MarketWatch site. And there'd
Oh,
be
yeah.
actually there was a I believe there was certainly notification that these were podcasts, but it was that felt like the dark ages compared to now.
Oh, yeah. No, my first foray into podcasting was actually uploading it directly to my website
Yeah,
and
there you go.
just encoding it manually. And I learned very, very quickly that one, my web host did not want me doing that, and then two, that it just was a lot of work. It was so much work, and so I'd manually coded all of those things, and I would upload using my FTP client, which at the time was actually my browser. The browser has had back then, they got rid of it now, but you used to have a built-in FTP client in your web browser. And so you could just use it. But there were others, CyberDuck and FileZilla. FileZilla still exists, and folks can download it and upload to their website that way as well. But anyway, yeah. So understand that you're basically putting it in the podcast directories as a mechanism for being kind of the single source of truth for your podcast. And that means those directories then are connected to by other services, other podcast apps. So, for example, when you submit to Apple Podcasts, then what's the name of the Apple Overcast? Overcast, right? They're going to look to Apple Podcasts directory in order to be able to automatically pull your podcast in there. So there's no submission really to the Overcast app. They're basically looking at Apple Podcasts and making you available by virtue of you being in Apple Podcasts, which also means that if someone uses Overcast as their podcast app and you are not in the Apple Podcasts directory, you do not exist. They'll never find you. They'll never be able to find you if they're using an app where their source is the Apple Podcasts directory. So we need to be very mindful of those kinds of things. And that's really what conjures in my mind, Steve, when you say new gatekeepers. It's because the podcast directories are doing that. And they're doing it for a number of good reasons, right? There are a number of really good reasons. There are a number of obviously, deleterious reasons that folks might want to gatekeep in a lot of ways, right? But this also allows for you fundamentally being seen more broadly or more narrowly as a business. So, for example, if your audience is predominantly in the United States or the United States and Canada or in English speaking countries, you can actually put yourself into directories that are focused on those populations and not say put yourself into any Asian language directories, right? So you can avoid getting traffic that you don't want to get, in particular countries or in particular languages. So that's in some sense helpful. I tend to think of it as not helpful, but I think it can be helpful, especially for small business owners who don't want to be seen widely by people who are never going to be able to buy from them, or even care about their products or services. So that's part of it as well. I think there's another piece to this, which is obviously there's search engines today. And as I said before, your blog post, the one that's associated with your podcast episode, is an incredibly important surface for you to be able to have podcast discovery. We're going to talk more about that in chapter 10. And there's another element that is absolutely the most important, I think, for being able to have a good podcast connection with your audience. And again, we'll cover that in chapter 10 there. I'm teasing you by not telling you what it is now. But you'll have to come and listen to next episode to do that. So think about this as distribution as not just being a technical component. And there is a lot of technical, and we're going to get into it momentarily, but it is really about podcast growth strategy, right? Being able to make sure that you grow your podcast in the right ways and directions that are going to get you the right audience to be found. And that has a lot to do with which categories you list yourself in, which directories. There are so many little fine points of being able to do this, which is why going into our next segment, we really want to talk about some of the issues that come up around having dozens and dozens of directories and those slight differences. So, Steve, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about submitting to the podcast directories, and then you just cut me off if you have something to add. But I want to get through this. You have to read the book in order to really get
Yeah,
into the
there's a
weeds
lot
here.
in there about this particular issue.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny because this is one of the shortest chapters in the
Mhm.
book, but it is probably one of the more dense to think about, and I'm gonna be recording videos to put on our YouTube channel, about how to submit to each of these directories, and I'll keep them up to date over time. Just short little things so you can see what it looks like, but the idea here is that this little bit of work, really will help you control your business and brand as it relates to the podcast. And what I wanna say here is that there are lots of services out there, reputable services too, Libsyn and Blueberry and Podbean and many others that will automatically syndicate your podcast episodes to directories. So you set up your podcast media host, you provide them with your files, they will create an RSS feed, and then they will automatically send them to Apple and to all the other various podcast directories. And to that, I personally, for your business, will say that Steve and I are going to encourage you to not do that. Right. And the reason why we're going to encourage you not to do that is because you should control your RSS feed and you should control the relationship you have between your RSS feed and the podcast directories. Now, that is not to say that there aren't great services out there that don't allow you to both control that relationship and also automatically syndicate to those. Case in point, I host podcasts across Libsyn, Blueberry, and Podbean, so I know them well, and I control my Apple Podcasts Connect account, which allows me to log in and look at my statistics and data and listeners and all of that stuff. Controls how my podcast metadata. I can change all those things, but it's attached to my Libsyn account, my Blueberry account, and so on and so forth, and they automatically help manage that in between. Now they could do it for me, but God forbid one of them goes out of business, right? And now all of a sudden I don't have an Apple Podcasts account, a Podcast Connect account to be able to manage that. And now I've lost that capability going forward. You would hope that they would go out of business in such a way that will allow you to have that transition be seamless. But I'm not going to, it's my business. I don't want to depend upon some third party for that kind of control over my connection with my audience. So I think it's just really, I think we think it's really important that you have that level of control from the get go. You do it once anyway. It's not like you have to do it over and over again. It's just a one time process. And then from there on out, it's all automated. And I know that hearing me say this now, it sounds like gobbledygook because it's all technical stuff. But
It is.
once you get into it, you will start to understand. You're going to go to podcastconnect.apple.com, for example. I'm using Apple as the primary because it's currently the most notable one. But you're going to log in. You're going to create an Apple. If you have an Apple ID, you just use your Apple ID. Or if not, then you're going to create an Apple ID. Then you're going to establish your Apple Podcast Connect account. You're going to create your podcast. You're going to take your RSS feed. You're going to place it in there, fill out all the forms, blah blah blah, and then in a couple of days they will approve it, and your feed will start flowing into the Apple Podcasts directory. Then you're going to go over to your media host and you're going to tell them that you're connected to Apple Podcasts Connect, and then they have a little feature of some kind in all of the major ones that says, hey, listen, this is my Apple Podcasts Connect account. Here goes my ID associated with my Apple Podcasts Connect podcast in the directory, and you're done. Right. And now going forward, you have control over your media host, you have control over Apple Podcasts Connect, and you have control over your RSS feed. I know that it sounds like I'm being very particular here, and that's because I am. But the other side is that you actually are going to be so much better off. And it goes back to kind of our point in the past episode about controlling the RSS feed so that, God forbid, something happens with your relationship with your podcast editor or with your podcast producer or something like that. You don't want to be in a lurch where you have to sue somebody to gain access to these kinds of things.
So let me, because of people may, they've heard the term RSS. We've done past episodes where we have mentioned RSS. I am not sure we actually talked about how you actually create your own RSS feed. So this would be a great opportunity to get into that, Ray, and you're the tech guy. So how actually would somebody who may not understand, that part of the equation, how would you create your own RSS feed?
Yeah. So any good website content management system, CMS like WordPress or Squarespace or Shopify, They're actually going to produce it for you. And they're literally, there's just going to be a setting somewhere in the features that says this is your RSS feed. For most WordPress websites, it's just going to be your domain name, so yourbusinessname.com/feed, FEED, and a forward slash. And then you can take that into a validator. And if you go into our podcast resources library on podcastingforsmallbusiness.com, you will find a validator in our resources library. You go to that validator, you place that link into the validator, and then it will tell you whether or not it is a podcast compliant feed or RSS feed. Hence why we call it RSS. That's why we call it the feed, right? Because so it's the RSS feed. And so RSS stands for rich site summary. And that rich part is the markup or the metadata associated with the site. It's just basically telling one site that another site has new information. And so the validator will tell you whether or not you have a compliant RSS feed. So for the most part, unless you are hand coding your website from scratch, in which case you don't need me to explain this, but for us mere mortals of small business owners who are not techie, your website should produce one. If you for some reason have a website that does not produce one manually, then there are other options. One is your podcast media host will inevitably have an RSS feed, and to my detriment, actually for most businesses, right? Because I don't like the fact that, for example, in my Libsyn account, Libsyn has an RSS feed, and I have to do a lot of haranguing of the system so that RSS feed never gets out into the world. Right, I have to shut off all kinds of features. I never, ever, ever want Libsyn's RSS feed to be out in the world. Why? Because I have a podcast website, and my podcast website has a feed, and that is the official feed of my podcast. Anyone who wants to listen to my podcast should subscribe to that feed, not to Libsyn's, right? So when that happens, then by accident or otherwise, that feed could actually get distributed to Apple Podcasts, and now I'll have two podcasts listed, and I don't want that, right? So you have to be very, very cautious about having only one podcast feed and only one listing in your podcast directories. And so this is very important from that perspective. But to create an RSS feed today is trivial. Once upon a time, it was more complicated. But today, really, anything that can create a blog can create a feed, can create the RSS feed itself. And then from there, as long as you can attach a media enclosure, right, attach an audio file, video file, or PDF into it in its own field, right, you'll have a separate field where you can do that. That's what turns it into a podcast. So in the WordPress world, I typically recommend folks to use the PowerPress plugin, and that's what allows you to, in essence, turn your blog into a podcast. And actually, in the WordPress world, you can have as many podcasts as you want. You can create many, many podcasts. You don't need to do that, but you could. And you can actually have your blog and your podcast kind of sit on top of one another. So you can blog all you want. Those blog posts that don't have an audio file will not get syndicated to a podcast directory because they lack the media enclosure. They lack the media file to make it a podcast. So when you do put out a podcast episode, that will have the audio file, and that will automatically get picked up by Apple Podcasts and Pocket Casts and Overcast and otherwise, and it will show up as a podcast episode. So you could do that. There are some downsides to that, but there are also upsides, right? There's just easier for you to manage one feed than managing multiple feeds. But PowerPress does a really great job because you can say, I just want the podcast only feed, and then provide that to your podcast directories. So did that answer your question, Steve?
Yes.
Fantastic.
I am not a tech guy. I'm an old guy. So this can get a little bit confusing for someone like me and for someone who is not technical. But I do believe that if you follow what Ray had to say and you understood what Ray had to say, it'll make your life a lot easier going forward so that you have, I mean, the bottom line is you want control. And that is so that ultimately that makes it easier for you, your brand, in case there's any issues going forward. You have the control. Troubleshooting will be easier as well.
Yeah, and I think that, if you're doing this as a hobby podcast, that kind of thing, yeah, sure, go use whatever podcast host, let them do it automatically, all that kind of fun stuff. But as it relates to a business, you should really be protecting your assets, and really your podcast RSS feed is an asset, and to lose control over that at any number of those pieces of the pipeline really does create downstream problems for you, and certainly devalues the podcast in some way, shape, or form. Especially if you come to me and say, hey, I'm looking to sell my podcast in the future, and you tell me you don't have control over different parts of the podcast. Like, what are you talking about? I'm not buying, basically an asset that has, it's like buying a car with no wheels. You're not getting the whole vehicle, and so that's a real problem. So in essence, when you go to submit to the podcast directories to syndicate, you're going to have a few important things: a valid email address, and this is really important. Every podcast directory is going to require you to, in some way, shape, or form, verify against a valid email address. I won't be and shouldn't be a problem for any of you, but be very mindful. And I don't say this in the book, and I think maybe version 2 or 3 in the future will do this. But
Oh,
you know,
you mean there's more coming, Ray?
yes, yes, at some point, at some point. But the goal here is that that valid email address be a business email address, and one that you have control over. Again, don't have this go to the business email address of your podcast editor or that kind of thing, right? It should be your email address, and you can always set it up to auto forward. Every email service has the ability for you to set up a filter to go ahead and auto forward emails to other people. Great. You don't want to see it? Fine. But it should be your email, and then auto forward those emails onto other people. Why? It's about being able to protect your brand, right? This is a protecting your small business's brand. And so you're going to have a valid email address. You're going to have some other elements there. You're going to have cover art, description of the podcast, a title to the podcast, and a few other elements, including that compliant, right? That validated podcast RSS feed. And then you're going to go to the various services. So that in this case, we talk about going to Apple and Spotify and Amazon and other places, and you're going to go ahead and follow the instructions to go ahead and submit them. And we provide those all in the book. This is my time, Steve. I know this episode is me dominant because this is kind of my jam, but I'm going to get on my soapbox here because I have a lot of problems with Spotify.
Can I
And
ask one can I ask one
yeah, yeah,
question
yeah,
before
yeah,
you
go for
get
it.
to that, before you go on your soapbox? So it's always bothered me that the requirements seem to always be slightly different for all these different directories, kind of like beta versus VHS back in the old days. Why can there, or I should say, why is there not a standard in that every directory is the same, requires the same whatever it is, same metadata, same artwork dimensions? Why is there not a standard? And we
Yeah,
don't
sure.
talk about this in the book at all, but I'm just curious as to
No,
your thoughts
this
on
is
this.
this is good. Yeah. So it's kind of like why you have a different Department of Motor Vehicles by every state, right? This is it's not just because of states' rights, right? But it's mostly because of the fact that we have a distributed system where you go to many different places, and those places have their own authority for being able to manage how the information is displayed, but also giving you authority to access a particular thing, like a driving privilege. In the podcast world, when you go to Apple Podcasts Connect to submit your podcast to the Apple Podcast directory, you are submitting to their system, and their servers are set up completely different than Amazon's, and completely different than Spotify's. We'll get back to my soapbox on that one. And completely different than YouTube podcasts, and completely different than, say, Deezer, or any of the others, right? So their server specs are designed to be able to feed the podcast out to the places where they know people are going to be listening to it in the way in which they can serve the files. So that's really the primary reason, is that's the server setup is going to dictate that. Plus, there's humans involved, right? So some human at Apple decided particular types of data were important, and that other types of data weren't important, right? And then you can go to another directory. For example, I don't know if we would call Podchaser a directory, but it is in a way. You submit more on a profile level, so you as the podcaster are submitting your podcast, sure, but also other podcasts that you've been a guest on or that you've co-hosted over time. So if you go to like Podchaser and search my name, you're going to see all kinds of podcasts that I've been on over time, both as a guest, as a substitute for as a co-host, just substituting for an episode. Others where I've been interviewed for other topics. All the podcasts that I've produced over time, and it's kind of again, it's almost like a social network more than it is a directory. But it's also a directory because it's showing a bunch of podcasts. You can just look for podcasts, and they've designed it so that you submit particular types of information so they can display it in the way they want to. And that's pretty much why every podcast directory is like that. I'll also say that many times it's defined around the technology that they own. So in the case of Apple, Apple wants your podcast. They don't care about how your podcast shows up on Overcast or any other podcast app. They definitely care how it shows up on Apple Podcasts app, right? They care how it shows up in iTunes or in the Apple Music app now. They care about how it's going to show up in their products on an iPad in the Apple Podcasts app and how it shows and displays on a Mac OS Apple Music app. That's what they care about. And then of course Amazon has their devices and they care how it's going to show up there, and so on and so forth. So it really
So
ends up
we
being
will, what I've just heard with that long explanation, we will never have a standard.
no.
Okay. I want people to be aware of that.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think there will ever be a standard in terms of that. And every time a new player comes on the market, I mean, Spotify, and in the podcasting world, Spotify didn't exist, 10 years ago, and now all of a sudden they're one of the top players. We now see. I was actually, this was a conversation for offline, but here we are, Steve. We're online and we're going to talk about it. I
Okay.
can't believe that Netflix now has a whole podcast section of video podcasts they're displaying to me on my smart TV, which we cover a little bit in the book here as well. It's like absolutely mind blowing that we have a section called podcasts on Netflix. My mind is blown, and of course I never want to be there, right? I care about audio podcasting much more than I care about video podcasts, but it will open up a whole new market to people who get Netflix deals and want to be able to syndicate themselves to Netflix. I have no idea how Netflix decides on those podcasts. Obviously, these are very high level, celebrity and highly reputable, not reputable, highly notable podcasters. And so this is a very different market, in terms of being seen. Certainly small business podcasts are not going to get syndicated to the Netflix surface, but it's very interesting to see that it's going to make it more popular, that people get aware of the podcast world by virtue of that. We have almost half, a little more than half of the US population listening to podcasts or having listened to a podcast. And now we're going to see a much larger group of people because they're going to see this thing called podcasts and Netflix and say, what the heck is a podcast, right? They're not going to be able to define it, right? As we've talked about, but they're now going to know it exists. And fun fact, I know we're going way off track today, but I watched the series Bodkin on Netflix, which is about a podcaster who goes to Ireland and to do like a true crime podcast, and it goes off the rails. Highly recommended if anybody wants to watch it. It was really good. So my soapbox, really quickly: Spotify is a terrible company, and they are trying to
Oh,
destroy.
don't hold back, Ray.
No, you know me. You know me. No, but I mean this in the most sincere way. Spotify has basically attacked the very RSS feed in podcasting, and we must be very, very mindful of this. Podcasting is an independent voice based platform. It allows anyone to speak, and the freedom associated with that, free podcasting, or the concept of free as in freedoms, just like free open source software, free is a license to be able to speak. This is really important for not just democracies, right? But this is important for businesses as well, to have a voice out there in the market where they can compete with big brands, big box retail, big box businesses that are competing for the same attention to the same markets. And when Spotify is capable of creating background deals with large corporations to edge out other voices that's not meritocratic, we create problems. And Spotify doesn't want RSS feeds to be available to anyone. All right. They are very, very controlled. And you can see them doing it in the way in which Spotify for podcasters was created. They created it in such a way that the podcast feed itself, the exposure of the actual file, the MP3, is all obfuscated behind these special links. Do not be fooled. Spotify does not care about podcasts. They do not care about podcasting. They care about selling memberships, and they care about advertising. And they will use, abuse, and spit out podcasts at the first sign that it is not providing them with more members and or more advertising service. And so, they've gone into the foray of now doing video podcasts because, everybody is on the bandwagon around video. And as Steve and I have talked about, we're not particularly as bullish about video in the podcasting space. We don't think that it's going to do as well. And I think that when it comes to video shows that are purpose built video shows will do fantastic, right? They'll do fantastic on YouTube, and they'll do fantastic on other platforms, including Spotify. But to try to ascribe what is supposed to be traditionally an audio focused program that you're just going to double as video, I think kind of undermines what video is there for, right? Video is there for a visual and audio emotional experience, and audio podcasting is something very different. It is for the emotive audio experience. And so they're just two different animals. I see them as two different things. I'm sure Steve sees them as two different things. And it's not that they both can't be useful. It's just that you got to think about them differently. We can use video for promoting our podcast, so we can use all kinds of things, but the actual podcast itself being audio is important. And I think Spotify is not your friend. And so we're going to use them, right? Syndicate to Spotify. Be seen there. Get value out of them, but do not let them control things like your RSS feed and or how you promote yourself. I always say, like, I want everyone to come to my website for everything related to my podcast. And if the listener happens to listen in Spotify, great. But I want them to come back to my website for everything. And soapbox. So
So that you led to a good transition here, though, into our third segment, I believe.
Yes.
There's a transition here, and that transition is you touched on smart TVs. Yes, we are audio focused, and we had serious discussions whether we need to include smart TVs in the book, which we do in this chapter. And I was pushing for it because it's a place where people are going now. Discovery, YouTube Discovery. Where can you get YouTube? You can get YouTube on your smart TV. So we had a back and forth about this particular issue, and it goes back to me and where we sort of talked about at the beginning of the episode, be everywhere you can be. And that, to me, smart TVs, where I think there is a Signal Hill Insights study that a third of weekly podcast consumers are using a smart TV for their podcasts. That was a survey they did last spring. That, to me, recognizing that importance. But so let's get into that a little bit. If you are going to be either listening or watching, because a lot of people are actually watching their podcasts on TV, a lot of them are actually listening. But so how do you optimize for smart TVs? And along with that, and this was part of our discussion, is smart speakers. You are a strong believer in smart speakers. You can't ignore smart speakers, but you can't ignore smart TVs. Get into that a little bit and talk about that from, optimizing for each.
Yeah. So there's some really good arguments you made, Steve, which is why we beefed up the smart TVs section in that chapter. I was very much not a fan
Yes.
of doing this, and you convinced me, and I think we made the right choice ultimately because of that. But also understand that there are two different kind of converging forces at the present moment. Generative AI has caused a convergence on one vector, and the other is that, as the Infinite Dial 2025 report said, noted in the book that we talked about, 75% of people own a smart TV now. So that there is this increased surface for podcasts to be discovered in line with the fact that YouTube is installed on all of them. So because YouTube is available on them, you can install podcast apps as well. It's probably unlikely that most people are installing podcast apps on their smart TVs, but YouTube is a really great discovery point for podcasting. And then people leave YouTube and subscribe to those podcasts or follow those podcasts in their podcast app of choice. So this is about discovery, not about distribution. And so again, we'll talk about this more in chapter 10 when we get to the next episode. But the goal here is that for those folks who do consume a lot of YouTube on their smart TV, this is a gold mine for businesses. It's like, without, you don't have to pay for advertising. You get to pay to consultatively sell to your audience directly in their living room, and or bedroom. Lots of people have multiple televisions around the house. And what I am noticing, at least among my peers and people that I know, they turn the podcast on. They're not watching. They're listening as they're, doing chores around the house. All right. They're doing all of these other things. But because of generative AI, we are now seeing the advent of more and more people being able to more fluidly use their smart speakers around the house. And those smart speakers are actually being integrated with their smart TVs across what's called Matter. So Matter is a specification. It's a protocol. We don't cover it in the book. We don't need to. But the idea here is that Google and Apple and Amazon and all the other big tech, they've chosen to use this protocol so that you can have a smart home that all of the devices connect and talk to one another. So if you have smart lights, intelligent lighting, intelligent doorbells, smart speakers, smart TVs, smart refrigerators, whatever you want, all of those things now talk utilizing the same language, which means now that, say that I'm listening to a podcast there on YouTube on my smart TV, I can now fluidly say to my smart speaker, hey, Big G, I would like to listen to this podcast that I was listening to on my smart speaker, and it will pick up where you left off and continue playing on that device. Now, is it going to play from YouTube? Is it going to play from your podcast app of choice? Those are things to be determined. And I think we're in a fluid space where that's going to change over time.
Would that matter?
Oh,
where
absolutely.
It's coming from?
Yeah.
Okay.
So think about it from the perspective that if you're trying to be seen by the most people with the most fluid experience, and your podcast does not have ads in it, it will have ads on YouTube, right? Right. So if I go to my smart speaker and I tell it to continue playing an episode, but I want you to start playing from minute 15 through Pocket Casts, right? Now it's pulling from my direct RSS feed on my website, which does not have ads, right? So there's a clear convenience factor. Nobody wants to listen to ads, even if ads are really important for a lot of businesses to operate and to have revenues. And so there is that kind of experiential difference. And so just be mindful of that. I mean, there is that reality factor. I think that there's going to be a surge in smart speaker purchases, especially as Apple comes into their own with regard to making Siri smarter. Siri is rather dumb right now, and everyone is pretty much aware of that. But Apple is in the process of adopting Google Gemini as their generative AI tool of choice. It's going to be a different flavor of Google, because Apple's going to, give it lots of Apple love, and it's gonna run in its own kind of shelled off system, and so it'll be very Apple-y. But now, when you go to your HomePod or you ask Siri on any of your Apple devices to listen to a podcast, it's going to be a different experience, and I think it's going to be a more positive experience because Siri won't be stupid, and so that's just a real positive. Maybe Apple will next fix Apple Podcast directory search, but don't get me on that soapbox. So we could talk about that story at some point as well. But the idea here is that for optimizing for speech is really important, because if you're calling things up by speech, it's very different. I'll give you an example. I have a podcast called Productivity Cast. If you once upon a time asked Amazon to find it, it could not. because it's a portmanteau of productivity and podcasts. So it was Productivity Cast all as one word, and it was just dumb enough not to understand that. So I had to, in the podcast feed, separate it. So they were two words. There was a space between productivity and cast. And then now, when you asked Amazon to open up the podcast, it was able to. So these weird quirks of speech, that software is just not good enough. And now with generative AI, you're going to get a much, much better, response to what your query is. And we fixed it since. I mean, I put Productivity Cast back together, and Amazon's better about it now. But we're going to see more and more of that kind of stuff. But that means that you're optimizing for smart speakers, means that if you have a podcast that has a weird name, like a portmanteau of something, or if it's a made up word, you're going to have to be very clear about the title of your podcast. So you may not just use the title of the podcast. Maybe your podcast is called Superfragilisticexpialidocious. Well, you might want to add to it, the business podcast about X, or the podcast about X product, so that it has enough context clues to go ahead and find it, not just by, a weird term.
So this brings us kind of full circle back to chapter 1,
Mhm.
in which we did talk about searchable, spellable, speakable in terms of your podcast name and your podcast tagline.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is a clear point where this comes back to benefit you by virtue of following that advice earlier in the book. You're going to come to this point, and you're not going to be as behind in terms of being able to get your stuff out there. We provide a pretty good sound check, which is our end of chapter checklist for folks. And I think that, just in the sound check, having a couple of items that we added in here that I think are really important to underscore for folks, which is that make sure that you have some kind of reminder system for being able to check in on your syndication connections. So all the directories that you syndicate to, it is really important for you to check them. No one's going to tell you that they can't hear your podcast episode. They're just going to change their habits and routines to find other podcasts to listen to. You would love for your listeners to be so hungry for your content that they will let you know. But you'll find out weeks later from them, and by that point, perhaps they've moved on to other podcasts. People listen to podcasts in their routines. So once you fall out of their routine, it's very difficult to get back in there. And that's not for everybody in every situation. There are definitely idiosyncrasies to that, but you want to stay in people's routines.
Mhm.
And so if you are not regularly checking in to make sure that your podcast is showing up in Apple Podcasts and it's showing up in Spotify, even just the idea that, like, the other day I went to my own podcast and I started looking, and I noticed that the cover art was not displaying. And it turns out there was a problem with my website. I changed a setting, messed it up. Now I've got a support ticket open trying to fix that. But these are things that, someone somebody, one of the staff members at your company, one of your employees, someone's going to change something somewhere, just in the heat of battle, getting through the work week, and stuff is going to break. And it's up to you. It's incumbent upon you to check those things to make sure that they are operating on a regular basis. So I like to just reduce the stress by putting something in the calendar to remind me to go check on those things. And for me, that's a weekly thing. For you, it may be less often than that. But I'm listening to my own podcast episodes every week, right? So when an episode publishes, I listen to it because I'm quality controlling, right? If I hear something majorly happening, say Apple's, feeding the podcast incorrectly, they're compressing something, and it sounds weird, I'm going to want to go back and fix that. But the goal here is for you to be able to have some checkpoint so that you can quality control what people are actually listening to. And this leads me to the second point. I've already said it, which is subscribe to your own podcast. Right? You should be subscribing to your own podcast. And I would also ask some close family and friends to also subscribe to the podcast. I know that I have, a couple, at least one of my siblings that listens to all of my podcasts. I know because at every holiday, they then tell me about everything that they've listened to. And
Good and bad, I'm sure.
yeah, it's all good. This
It's
one's
all-
very very complimentary, which is a nice little empowering, motivating thing to always hear them speak so positively about the material they're listening to. And again, it's a part of their routine. They have a long commute in the morning, and they listen to my podcasts when they come out. and they absorb it and then they talk to me about it, and it's a lovely yeah, it's a lovely kind of thing that we have. And um it's just also nice because if something goes wrong, they're gonna tell me, right? They're that's my sibling, they're gonna be like, "Hey, there's something wrong with your podcast feed. I didn't get it this morning, and it's a part of my routine. I want to listen to it on in this morning," and then I could be like, "Okay, there's something wrong. I can go in and immediately fix it." So having people who are close to you who are listening can be really, really helpful. They don't even need to listen in the depth and breadth that my sibling does, but just being a recipient will tell you, hey, you know what? I noticed that your podcast episode feed is also all of a sudden showing a bunch of weird random characters in the title. What's up with that? Maybe your website changed. Maybe the way in which you've been publishing your episodes, you copy and pasted some metadata from Word into the title field, and it picked up some gobbledygook. So those are the kinds of things that are really, really helpful for you to be able to have folks who who are listening, you trust, to be able to give you that kind of raw feedback. Or, you know what, your voice sounds terrible on this episode, not because your voice generally sounds terrible, but because maybe there's some crackling that's happening. Maybe the recording went wrong, and you didn't notice because you recorded, handed it off to the podcast, editor. They were like, well, can't fix it, and so they go ahead and go with it, and so that's how that goes. Steve?
You just reminded me, I know this is way off tangent, but you just reminded me, my mother used to listen to me when I was on the air in New York City, and she would listen to see if I was okay. So there'd be like, if I had a cold, she'd call me up and say, "Do you have a cold? Is there something? Are you feeling okay?" So you just reminded me of that. Sorry, I needed to get that in there.
No, no, it's actually very true. I mean, and my podcast episodes are usually recorded far in advance of the actual release. And so people will frequently be like, "Hey, do you have yeah, are you sick?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, that was 2 months ago." But yes, yes, I am feeling
Yes.
much better now. So it is a way for people to keep tabs on you about these things. And um I wanted to talk about maybe some of the minor pitfalls before we close out, which is that I think to a great extent, people feel like they don't need to fill out all of the fields when you go to submit to podcasts. And I will submit to you that it is really important that you complete all of the fields in all of the podcast directories. Unless the field says don't fill this out, if there's no information to put in there, really make sure that everything is complete. This will both reduce the chances of you being rejected, but also every bit of that data is going to be picked up by the podcast directory's search facility, potentially also being picked up by Google and the other search engines, and ultimately fed into the other podcast apps where search is also being utilized. So you have all of these various search engines, in essence, where these little pools of discovery are capable, but you're not capable of being found if you don't fill in those fields, especially the description field. I mean, really, you're being given a field where you can put almost anything you want. Like the idea of keyword stuffing in Google is really bad, but you could put as much text. I mean, don't keyword stuff, but you could put as much text as you want. In Apple podcast directories, 3,000 characters. You could write a pretty good amount of stuff so people
Mhm.
know what your podcast is about, what topics and what keywords you want people to find you about. If Apple Podcast search was better, but anyway, I'm not going there, Steve. I'm not going there. But
You're close. You're close to
I am.
going
I'm
there. You're
very
very
close. Very
close.
close.
Very
Yes.
close.
It angers me every time I think of it. But the idea here is that you want to make sure that you are completing all the fields. Two is completing the fields honestly. So if you go ahead and select a category for your podcast, and it is not what your podcast is about, then don't do that, right? Because this is going to confuse the people who are listening to you, or who find you and get information that's completely counter to what they're expecting to listen to. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't rotate your podcast categories on a regular basis. So, for example, I podcast mostly about small business productivity and technology, and there is no category for any of those. They're like kind of a mixture of things. So there's a self improvement category. So I could potentially put personal productivity under self improvement, but I could also put it under mental health. Health and fitness, mental health is a category. And to a great deal, mental fitness is a big product or element of personal productivity. When I talk about small business, there's a business and a business careers, business management, business entrepreneurship. And so I typically choose the category that's business entrepreneurship, but there are also topics where we talk about business management. Most podcast directories give you multiple categories to choose, so usually three, so you can kind of diversify where people can find you. So I believe, yes, you should probably change it around and see, hey, over time, does that get you found by more or less people in particular categories? But don't completely choose, like, a topic that is way off track from what you're actually trying to do, because it's a bit of a bait and switch for the listener. And I think that's sometimes I see that in, I'll find a podcast in a directory and I'm like, what is this? This has nothing to do with that topic. And that could be a little bit disconcerting for folks. Steve, any final thoughts before we close out?
So let's go with this. Creating a great podcast is not enough. If people can't find it, they can't listen. So own your RSS feed, show up everywhere your listeners are, make it simple for them to subscribe or follow, download, and listen. Do all that, and you will set yourself up for success.
Fantastic. In our next episode, we're going to be covering chapter 10, which is our chapter called Promoting Your Podcast. And it's kind of prima facie. We're going to talk all about how you promote your podcast. And of course, you can also order the book. And I think chapter 9, just for chapter 9, is actually a really helpful thing where you have the book so you can actually go through it. And so if you go to podcastingforsmallbusiness.com, you can go ahead and grab a copy of the book and access the resources library, especially, which has a bunch of resources. And we're adding more each week as I make my way through my little checklist of things that I want in there. I'm adding things in there. And with that, we will see you all next time. I'm Ray Sidney Smith with Steve Orr for Podcasting for Small Business. Take care.